My name is Average Joe, and I'm a proud geek with expertise in movies, superheroes, and animation.
My name is Beef Pork Ribs. I'm a fine repository of esoteric knowledge, which I suppose most people would qualify as geeky. Though I dabble in many fandoms, my main areas of expertise are anime, movies, and Belgian comics, with a strong recent insurgency of D&D.
Our mission is to bring nerd and geek culture to the masses
by sticking it all under the microscope.
Welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast.
Movies, comics, graphic novels, TV, cartoons, animation, nerds or geeks, entertainment culture. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power. Nerds and geeks, come gather around the scene. Come and join us in the Bat Jar. Come and tune into Average Joe and his team. Lots of room here in the Bat Jar. When the newest nerdy news drops, these podcast pals put it under the scope. DC, Marvel, Disney, Star Wars, cinematic, multiverses, mega Christmas, strangest franchise. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power.
Hello there, and welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast, where we put nerd and geek culture under the microscope. I am excited for this episode, Before Gribs, because we once again have a large collection of guests with us today. Are you excited?
I am excited for the amount of guests, and especially for who the guests are. The subject is also an interesting one, so yeah, it's a pretty exciting week we got.
I got my leftover popcorn from the movies with me here. I did indeed. I told our listeners last week that I was going to try and check out what the movie theater situation was like now. So yesterday I went with a friend. We saw The Empire Strikes Back in the movie theater. Very easy to get a parking spot because the place was pretty much empty. Our room we were in had like 3 other people, and they had us. You had to buy tickets in advance, and they only allowed you to sit in pairs, and so they kept us pairs apart. You had to wear a mask inside like the theater, but they said once you were in your seat, you were allowed to take it off. So it was quite nice. Once I was actually sitting there with my popcorn watching the movie, I was able to take the mask off. But for the most part, it was a very safe experience. They've got all the measures in place. And it was just nice to be back in the movie theater, even though I wasn't seeing like a new movie. But for Empire Strikes Back, it's a movie that, of course, I've seen a bunch of times, but never seen it on the big screen. And one fun detail I noticed is that on Yoda, he actually has like little old person whiskers, like above his lip. He has little whiskers, a little mustache growing, just like you would expect on like a really old person. And I had never noticed that before. We're going to get into connecting with our returning guests. So Mjolnir is back. Mjolnir, welcome back to the show.
Hello. Happy to be back. I had to come back for this topic because it's like one of my favorite shows at the moment.
So what kind of nerdy or geeky things have you been up to since you were last on the show?
Well, I binge watched all of Umbrella Academy Season 2 like the day it came out. So that was pretty recent. Beef Pork Ribs has been showing me One Piece, and we just finished Parasite. The Maxim? Is that what it's called? Yeah, the Maxim, which is like a fairly short anime, which was pretty intense. Yeah, I don't know. It's been mostly animes that Beef Pork Ribs has been showing me. He's trying to educate me.
Well, God bless you for putting up with all that. We also have returning this week, Libra the Book Lady.
Hi, everybody.
So what kind of nerdy or geeky things have you been up to since you were last on the show?
I also binge watched the entire season 2 of The Umbrella Academy within a day. So I don't really know what happens in each episode because I watched it like one giant movie. Other things I've been up to, I've been reading web comics on a website called Webtoon. The one that I've been most obsessed with that just came back from a hiatus was called Lore Olympus, and it's a retelling of the Hades and Persephone myth, and it's set in modern day, and it's absolutely fantastic. I've also been watching the Seven Deadly Sins anime on Netflix, and they also just released a new season. I'm re-watching the previous season because it's been a while since it came out. and hopefully I will be able to get to season 4 soon.
Well, we're glad to have you back. And with those two returning guests, that completes our What You Been Doing segment that we always do for returning guests. But we also have one new guest this week, and so we got to do our segment New Guest Who Dis. And so I welcome to the Bachelor podcast for the first time El Pacifico.
Thanks for having me, guys. I'm super excited. We have been talking about this for some time now, and yeah, I'm stoked to have you guys pick my brain and let's talk about this because you guys said you binged Umbrella Academy season 2 in the last couple of days. I binged the entire series of 2 seasons in 3 days, so I'm ready.
So, El Pacifico, every time we bring a new guest onto the show, we ask them two questions. So the first one is, what kind of nerd or geek are you?
Are there like categories? I guess
Whatever.
that question kind of tells it all too, eh? I would say like I'm really big. I was really introduced to the nerd culture reading a lot of graphic novels when I was younger. So I read Umbrella Academy a couple of years ago when I saw that it was the frontman for My Chemical Romance that wrote this, or it was his idea or something. And I was like, this is kind of weird. And I thought it was kind of like, oh, this is kind of like a goth version of X-Men. But then uh, the more I developed my love for nerd culture and stuff, like superheroes and stuff, but I'm also really into like professional wrestling. And I love movie adaptations of graphic novels because, I've yet to see a really, really bad one that I hate. And yeah, I'm also really big into board games. So anything from card games to Catan to whatever you need. And yeah, hopefully that suffices. Next question.
What kind of nerd or geek do you want to be?
I'd love to be able to like tell you which issue things happened on or happened in when, because I've met people who could tell me when Superman first did this, and I was like, wow, like I don't have that knowledge. Um, yeah, I'd love to be able to quote origins like on the spot, and hopefully through this community, I'll be able to get a step closer to that.
Very good. Well, El Pacifico, we're happy to have you join us in this week's episode. So if you're doing the math, we got myself and Beef Pork Ribs, who you usually listen to, Mjolnir and Libra the Book Lady, who you've heard before, and El Pacifico. So there's 5 of us today, as we are going to be talking about the Umbrella Academy. We first mentioned this show, comic book series, on the podcast when we were doing our Memory Lane miniseries, when we were talking about the year 2019 and how it was one of the new TV shows of that time. And lo and behold, the second season has now come out on Netflix. So we're going to get into something we always do when we have a new topic or we're talking about a franchise for the first time, our Secret Origins segment, or SOS. And so for each person here, we're going to find out how they had their first experience with the Umbrella Academy as a franchise. And El Pacifico, since you're our new guest, we'll start with you. How did you first get exposed to the Umbrella Academy?
Oh well, actually, I used to work at Chapters here, and one day we received a shipment of graphic novels that came out of the truck. I used to work graveyards, so and that night it was my job to stock up the graphic novel section, and then I pulled out one of these. I think it was Volume 1 of Umbrella Academy, and I saw Gerard Way. I was like, "Is this the same guy?" And then I just kind of caught myself every couple minutes flipping through the pages, and yeah, and that's how I heard about Umbrella Academy.
And you proceeded to read it, I assume?
Yeah, here and there. I didn't want to commit to buying the volume, so I just kind of flicked through it a couple of times during my shifts, and then that was it.
Fair enough. Well, Libra the Book Lady, how were you first introduced to this series?
I first saw a trailer for it on YouTube, I think. for the TV show. I hadn't heard of the comics. I saw the big names of the main actors, Ellen Page, Tom Hooper, and Colm Fiore, and knew that whatever was happening, I had to see this because I love Colm Fiore on his own. My best friend, uh, who I was living with at the time, she's a big fan of Ellen Page, and we both are big fans of the MCU and superheroes in general. So it just seemed like, oh, this is kind of weird and quirky and kind of right up our alley. And oh, look, it happens to be based on something written by Gerard Way. And I'm a very, very old school MCR fan, like all the way back to high school. So I just absolutely loved the concept. And when the series came out, we definitely watched it within a couple days. And it was one of the most awesome things I've ever seen, and the actor who plays Klaus is now one of my favorite people in the universe.
Very good. Well, Mjolnir, how were you first introduced to the Umbrella Academy?
My friend Jack, he's the one who got me into cosplay in the first place. We cosplay a lot together, and he started cosplaying the character of Five a lot. He really, his favorite is Vanya, but he likes cosplaying Five more. So like he built like a whole, he's got a super impressive like Umbrella Academy uniform that he made himself. And I was like, and he was like, oh, it's a good show. And I was like, okay, sounds cool. Like I love superheroes. I'll probably check it out. And then he asked me to be part of a group cosplay he was getting together. He originally asked me to be Diego, and I was like, okay. Um, Eventually, I ended up being Klaus day of because someone canceled, which I was happy about because Klaus is best boy and I adore him. And so it was kind of a weird experience because like watching that show for the first time, I like associated Five really strongly with my friend Jack because I knew Five as my friend's interpretation um of Five before I knew the real Five. And then also like I have a deep soft spot for Diego, and like I feel like it might be because when I first watched it, I watched the show being like, I'm going to be this character. I'm going to be dressing up as this character soon, so I was like looking for things to identify with. And yeah, so cosplay is what got me to that. Also, TikTok, Umbrella Academy took over TikTok for like a month and a half. It was everywhere. You saw Klaus cosplayers like every 2 seconds on the For You page. So like it was a mix of TikTok and my friend, mostly cosplay stuff that made me be like, this looks cool, these characters look cool, and people seem to like them a lot. And I watched it and I was like, I see what the hype is about. I love this a lot.
Beef pork ribs, how were you introduced to this interesting series?
There was this very strange girl that I knew, and we started dating, and then she wanted to make me cosplay her character's boyfriend. And so, well, one of the first things, yeah, Mjolnir and I did together, or watched together after we started dating, was the Umbrella Academy because, yeah, I had to be Ghost Dave for cosplay at G Anime, I think.
Mhm.
Yeah, it was at G Anime. So yeah, I had like I'd seen it on Netflix, and I knew there was a lot of hype around it, but it didn't really seem like my kind of show, and I was like, maybe I'll check it out, maybe not. But then yeah, I was told I had to watch it, and so I did, and I don't regret it. I still, as far as like new things that came out that are superhero like but not, I think I would much rather the boys, but you know, yeah, you do what you can with what you got.
Well, I literally I can't even remember how. I think I probably saw like articles on comicbookmovie.com announcing that the show is going to be made and that it was based on a comic book. And I remember seeing like casting announcements and release date announcements, and you're scrolling through a website that has all kinds of different news topics, and you're choosing which ones to actually click based on the headline. And because I had no familiarity or attachment to the Umbrella Academy, I just sort of skimmed over those articles. So I knew that it was happening. I knew it was a thing, but I was not interested in checking it out. At that point, my TV time, like even when season 1 came out, my TV time was so consumed by the Arrowverse that I just did not have space to take on more TV shows. And between the Arrowverse, the Marvel Netflix, there was a while there where I just I was bordering on the amount of TV time I was uncomfortable with. So the Umbrella Academy just didn't hit my radar, unfortunately. And wasn't until Memory Lane when we kind of like brought it up again, and you Beef Pork Ribs, you kind of gave it a good selling point. And it was really only this past week where I actually sat down and watched the first 5 episodes of season 1. So I have now had some exposure to the series, and doing a bit of research on the comic, I can see why it has such a fan base, and I can see why people really like it. So there you go. There has been our Secret Origin segment on the Umbrella Academy. And before we get too far into talking about the show, we're going to talk a bit about the comic book here. It was published by a company called Dark Horse Comics, which is probably something, just to get a sense here. Is anyone who's on this podcast familiar with Dark Horse Comics?
I'm aware of it, I guess. Like I was always more of a Marvel person and DC some, but I feel like Dark Horse like it's like the biggest name in more independent comics, right? Is my understanding. I read the first volume of Umbrella Academy after watching the show because I wanted to like read the source material. But like it didn't like come on my radar till after the TV show made it more obvious. Is that the word? Like available, I guess.
I'm generally aware of Dark Horse Comics, but that's mostly because they had the licensing rights for a few different mangas, most notably Hellsing. But there's also a few other series that are Dark Horse that I've read. So yeah, generally aware of it.
Yeah, I used to read a lot of Dark Horse actually. So I um they published 300, if you guys remember that movie. So I read some Dark Horse issues of 300, as well as Sin City, if you guys ever watch that. I they did the original like black and white type of graphic novels for them. And also they did stuff like they used to publish a lot of Godzilla. I never read too much of that, but they did some of that. Same with like Alien versus Predator and Planet of the Apes. So they've done some of that stuff. And I remember the weirdest. I can still picture it. The you guys might want to Google this. They did an issue of Superman versus the Terminator, which was really funny. And I think that's Dark Horse. I'm gonna try to remember that, but yeah. So like I'm fairly familiar with Dark Horse.
I did not realize that Dark Horse published Hellsing, but Hellsing was one of the first proper animes that I ever watched, which I know, like, we're going to expose you to anime and just throw you in the deepest, darkest pit there is. So, and I was a huge fan. And when I went to find the manga that it was based on, I guess something registered in my brain that it was Dark Horse, because when the name came up, when Umbrella Academy was first being released, saying from Dark Horse Comics, something a bell went off in the back of my head. I couldn't tell you what it was. So thank you for letting me know that.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to. Is Dark Horse the one that like had a lot of is that the one that had a lot of the rights to like comic rights to movie adaptations? Like, because I think like El Pacifico was saying like with Superman versus Terminator and stuff that I'm pretty sure it's is it that banner or whatever that those fall under, because I know I feel like they're not as popular now, but there was a time where there were a lot of like comic book like like novelizations but in comic books form or whatever, or like capitalizing on popular movies, right? I'm pretty sure it was Dark Horse.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to get at here is when you think of superhero comics, most people think of either Marvel comics or DC comics because those are kind of like the two juggernauts of superhero comics and comic book publishing in general. But there are a lot of independent, much smaller companies that also publish comic books. And Dark Horse, for a long time, was kind of considered, as you pointed out, Mjolnir, kind of like the third company. Like it had, while Marvel and DC both had like 30 to 35 to 40% market share, like Dark Horse would have like 5%, and they would be like number three as a result of that. That was a big thing they did, is they did movie adaptation comics of different films. So that was a thing they did. They did a lot of manga licensing, which is something that they did. But I want to highlight here with the Umbrella Academy, one of the big things that Dark Horse has always had as part of its comic book publishing is they publish creator owned content, which means that when a person writes and draws a comic book, they still are considered the owner of that comic book, and Dark Horse simply publishes the comic on their behalf. If anyone works for Marvel or DC Comics, anything that they write or create or draw becomes the property of the company. So for Stan Lee creating all those characters, Marvel Comics owns them, and Stan Lee was just a work for hire who did work for the company. But in the case of anything published by Dark Horse, the rights belong to whoever created it. So Hellboy is probably one of the most popular, most famous Dark Horse Comics characters. Another one is The Mask. If you guys recall that movie with Jim Carrey, we won't mention the sequel, but those are examples of Dark Horse comics that are wholly owned and by the creators, but then Dark Horse is a publishing vehicle for that.
The Webtoon webcomic site that I mentioned earlier, they have two sides to their website. So I guess this is kind of comparable to what you're talking about as far as like licensed, like Marvel versus like individual creators. Their two sides are called Originals and Canvas. The stuff that's published on Canvas can be published anywhere else on any other website. It's just another platform for content creators to showcase what they're doing. On Webtoon Originals, that side of the website, it's specifically only ever published on Webtoon. It is still technically, I think, mostly owned by the creators, but you'll only ever see that material only ever on Webtoon. So I guess that's kind of the comparison that I can draw from my own experience.
Yeah, I just was like, I think it's a really good I think it's a really good practice, and the reason to have creator owned stuff, right? And the like, my understanding is that like the reason that it was made that way was because it was made by a bunch of comic book artists and creators who had been screwed by the system a bit and had poured so much work and thought into things, especially early on in comics, right? Like a lot of those really classic characters, like the mythos of these characters that we know so well, were created by specific like artists or writers at the time, and then they weren't given the credit for that really, and didn't get anything out of adding to this mythos. It just went into Marvel's pocket or into DC's pocket, right? So I think it sucks that, you know, people had to get screwed over to like think of this, to be like, oh, let's set this up in a way that does benefit creators more. But I think it's really nice that they took that experience and turned it into something good. And like we said, I think it's one of the biggest, obviously not near the level of in people's mind as Marvel and DC, but it is one of the bigger brands, you know, now for comics. So like that's really great and impressive for them.
Yeah, and it's great that things like the Umbrella Academy show on Netflix are putting the name of Dark Horse Comics out there more, so perhaps people will go and find more Dark Horse comics to read. The other thing that makes Dark Horse unique is that they generally focus on limited series and comic books that get published in volumes as opposed to just ongoing monthly series that can go on forever. And so with the Umbrella Academy, for example, volume 1 was published in 2007, and there have been 2 volumes published since then. So there isn't a whole lot of content available for the Umbrella Academy as a franchise because it hasn't been kind of put through the same corporate machine, I guess you would say, that Marvel and DC comic characters are put through.
The nice thing about Umbrella Academy, though, is that, yeah, like you said, there's not a lot of. In one way, there's not a lot to draw on for the show, but in other way, there's too much. Like, I've only read the first volume, but so much happens in that first volume. Like, and obviously, the show doesn't follow the original source material super closely, but there's just so much going on, and there's stuff in that first volume that they had, that they didn't even touch on till like the second season, and some stuff I think they still haven't touched on, right? And I don't know, I think it's really cool that Gerard Way did manage to pack so much interesting information and like character into a smaller package. He didn't need years and years of history to do it.
Yeah, and it's been mentioned several times here, but indeed the lead singer of My Chemical Romance, which is a band I've only ever heard the name of. I tried watching some YouTube videos of their songs, and I didn't recognize any of them. So I'm sorry for anyone who's listening to this or who's on the show today who is a fan. It's very interesting that we have a musician who's also a comic book writer, and this series is published by an artist named Gabriela Ga, or actually I can't remember their name right now. I'm sorry, artist of the Umbrella Academy. But point is, those are the people that are responsible for it. And Dark Horse is the one that published it. So let's really start talking about the actual show itself. The first season of the Umbrella Academy premiered on Netflix last year in 2019, and the second season just premiered a week or so ago at the end of July 2020. So how we're going to approach this, we're going to talk about the show and the franchise itself.
The apocalypse is in 8 days. The only chance we have to save our world is us.
This kind of stuff is dangerous.
Who are these guys? They're here to stop us.
It's terrifying.
Come on! We meet new people and then kill them. We have the best job.
Whenever I've looked at a description of the Umbrella Academy, they talk about it as a dysfunctional family of superheroes. And I found this interesting because there have been, since comic book superheroes have been a thing for 80 plus years, there have been many different series that have attempted to deconstruct the franchise or poke fun at it or kind of do a classic version of the story with a huge twist. Series like Watchmen or The Boys or Kick-Ass, they're all kind of different variations of comic book superheroes. And from what I could tell, it seems like the Umbrella Academy is more so, I guess, deconstructing the whole superhero team concept. And I couldn't help but, of course, draw a comparison to the X-Men when I was looking at this. Did anyone else have a similar experience when first experiencing the show?
Now that you mention X-Men, honestly, that comparison didn't occur to me just because the experience of working as a team is so different. Like, just the ideas behind working as a team play out so differently between the Hargreaves family and the X-Men. What I think it is, as far as deconstructing, it's deconstructing what raising superheroes from children does to them later on in life. And how can you expect them to still function like a family, tell them they're a family, but also be superheroes and raised by somebody who doesn't even like children? So, whereas compared to the X-Men, like, Professor Xavier loves children, thinks teaching is his life goal, and also thinks it's his life's goal to take care of mutants and better society for mutants and humans to live together. And maybe it is a little bit of brainwashing that happens going to his school for gifted youngsters, but I don't think it ever really evaluates what it's like for the people who are raised in that school and what it's like for them later on in life.
Yeah, I think I agree with Libra, especially because that's the interesting focus. That's like the biggest difference, I think, between the X-Men and the Hargreaves siblings. And like it's a fair comparison, but the thing is that to at least a certain extent, the X-Men had a choice. Yes, it's like, they were driven from their home. Some of them, they're driven from their homes. This is the only chance or choice they have. But it's still they're coming from somewhere else, and they're choosing to be a part of this new family because their original family failed them, right? And they're being brought together by someone who like, people throw shade at Professor X sometimes for bad decisions he makes, which is fair, but he still like, he means well, and he at heart, he's doing this like for the betterment of humanity and mutants and all this stuff. Whereas the Hargreaves, yeah, this has been their whole life. They've never known anything else but this environment they're brought up in, which is so militarized and horrible. Like, in the first season, when you see they're walking through their childhood home and you see these pictures on the wall of like these children's pictures, like see Tom run, but it's like a kid like doing a karate pose or whatever, right? And that's such, like, you get this visceral feeling looking at that, like, that should not exist. Like, a child doesn't need to be learning that stuff at an age where you need such a cute little picture to like portray it. It's just, it feels wrong. And these kids who are raised without love for a long time, and it's really sad. And the thing that gets me is, yeah, Hargreaves is like the worst qualities of Professor X, because yeah, apparently he seems to like, for the greater good, like, want what's good overall, but he doesn't care how he gets there, and he doesn't care about what he's doing to these people in order to turn them into weapons.
I think that's honestly the bigger difference here, is really the difference between, Charles Xavier and Reginald Hargreaves, is that Charles puts the well-being of the students above, most of the time, above the greater good and above kind of the big picture, whereas Sir Reginald Hargreaves has the greater good above anything. And to be honest, his interpretation of the greater good is probably more what he values than an actual ideal.
Yeah, like I immediately in the first episode, that's what I thought of immediately, was like the X-Men. Except, I guess we'll talk about this a little more later. But I've noticed that the seven siblings, as the series goes on, kind of portray like one, or at least one aspect of Sir Reginald Hargreaves. And like, I didn't really start to notice it more until the second season, when you finally like see a little more. But yeah, I think that the full motivation for Sir Reginald Hargreaves has yet to be kind of unraveled. Meanwhile, like with X-Men, I've just grown up with it, with Professor X, and knowing about like the background with X-Men and this and like the civil rights movement inspiration and stuff like that. That it's easy for me to kind of say like, yeah, Reginald's like not a good guy. But if my theory is correct, that like the seven children are exhibiting like one or more aspects of Sir Reginald's personality, then like something like five, who like is just like, doesn't matter how you feel, because he knows the greater good, he's just gonna do it. And then I'm like, okay, I see that he could pick that up from Sir Reginald. Or like the little bit of compassion that he might have shown is actually shown through Klaus. Like Klaus actually cares more than he lets up. He just like doesn't like the pain, I guess. Anyway, I don't want to spoil any more than that, but I definitely see the resemblance with the X-Men.
Yeah, I found it interesting watching. I guess we should briefly kind of describe the starting point for the show for people. I mean, it like the BPR, you kind of did this before, but maybe if you could just once again kind of give everyone the Twitter tweet description of the story for the audience, so that as we start talking about it more intentionally, people will know what at least the starting point is.
Yep. This rich guy that we don't know much about decided to buy some babies who were born through supernatural causes on the same day, and then raise them as superheroes slash obedient soldiers. They grew apart and then returned together because their adoptive dad died, and one of them was time traveling and told them that they have to avoid the creation of the apocalypse.
Perfect. I found it so interesting in the even in the first like opening scenes of episode 1. There's a guy on the moon. He's just living on the moon in like this fancy trailer, and there's super intelligent monkeys that are talking and robots designed to look like people, and there's all kinds of stuff that feels like it's straight out of a comic book, but through I don't know if this was intentional on the show's part, but they were also like trying to keep it very grounded and keep it very focused on the characters. So it felt like an unconventional superhero story, like this idea that this rich guy basically like just bought a bunch of babies and raised them to be superheroes and didn't really love them in the conventional way. It's a very unconventional story for a superhero comic book or for a TV show, but there's so many, I guess, trappings or tropes of superhero comics that are all over the place. Like they actually refer to the little mask with the white eye slits as a domino mask. It's like that is something that unless you read superhero comics, you would never hear someone talk about that. But this show just kind of embraces all those tropes while telling this unconventional story. It's a show that really kind of gives you little nuggets of information as you go through. So, as someone who has not read the comic, when I was watching the show, admittedly, I was intrigued to keep watching because they were giving you little kind of snippets about who the
Is that
characters
too
were, and like
spoilerific?
you don't even know. I've seen 4 or 5 episodes. I still don't really know like what a lot of the people's powers are, because there's never a moment where they just go out and explain this is what this person's power is. You kind of like either see them use their powers, or the way they talk about the effect that their powers had on their life, and you kind of you have to either draw conclusions or just keep watching to kind of get to an answer. So admittedly, that's certainly one way to keep people watching your show, is to not give them all the information right up front. But it kind of asks the question above all else, what would happen to a person if they had this kind of upbringing where they were basically brought up in like a military school without any real sign of love or affection, and really like, I don't want to use the term child soldier because I think that's a little extreme for this situation, but these children were basically raised for the intention of becoming superheroes for a cause that was not their own. And you see them all as adults and like the different kind of problems they now have as adults as a result of their childhood. And they're all different. Like there's 7 members of the Umbrella Academy, and how they got to where they are in present day is all very different. So I don't know, for each of you guys, was there anything about this? Did it make you question the parenting style of this rich dude?
A little bit. Like I'm somebody who, when I watch something, I'm fairly like skeptical. Like I'm already looking for holes and stuff. And so when when they were all brought together and they start like talking about like how crappy their childhoods were, immediately I was like, well, there's obviously something that like they weren't told or whatever. But then whenever they go back to flashbacks of just how Sir Reginald like treated them, in my head I was like, oh, for all these kids know, he's not superpowered, so why don't they just take him down? Like in my head I'm just like, why don't they just do that? But there was also like, but I'd like to think that I guess the 7 of them knew that there was like there was value in what they were learning, even though they didn't enjoy it. But to your original point, yeah, the parenting style, Like that's what I would have done. I would have like if I figured out that I was super strong at 13 and this 80-year-old guy is trying to tell me what to do, and he's not even my real dad. Yeah, he gave me a life, but I'm also like out there almost dying just because he told me to. I might fight back. That's me.
Well, that's the problem with being raised in that environment, though. Like, to them, that's normal. Think of even like, I know earlier we were talking about all the crazy stuff that happens in that, like, they treat a robot mom and a talking chimpanzee butler as normal. Like they treat that as completely normal. That's just their lives. This is just the way they grew up, right? And like I imagine even and for someone like Allison raising a child later on, cuz she's the only one of them who has well had a family and still has a kid. And that must have been so hard for her to like she wouldn't even know where to start to have a healthy relationship with a kid. It's not surprising that like later on it turns out she may have made some poor choices in her marriage and in her and in raising her kid, how she dealt with tantrums and stuff. Because I mean the way her dad dealt with tantrums was with fear and punishment, and like he locked Klaus in with ghosts, like just in a mausoleum. That wasn't even like a punishment, that was training. So imagine what his punishments were like. Like these kids are raised with like they had no concept of love until the robot mom, which is still like an odd way. She has odd ways of expressing it because she's not human, and the closest thing they have to love is from a machine, and they're not taught to value their own lives. Luther almost dies because since he was born, his entire life has been he has to do what dad says. He's the one the brainwashing worked on the best, probably.
Yeah, I guess you're speaking to like nature versus nurture, like how much of their character is just who they are versus their environment.
I think also to a certain point, I may be speculating him as to why Mjolnir does feel strongly for these characters, but also like I mean, you were homeschooled for basically your entire life, and it does have I don't know, like I wasn't homeschooled that long, but it does have this kind of like the worst part of homeschooling is when you like start hanging out with people and realize that everything you've been doing with your family isn't normal, because most kids like you know, you always think that the way your family acts is the way that everybody's family act until you start being exposed to other people. And in their case, you know, the even at the beginning, they started being exposed when they went on mission, and people kind of accepted that they were superheroes. So that didn't actually change their perception of the world much. It was like, yeah, dad said we have important training and we're doing this for a good reason. People are cheering us on for what we do. It must be for a good reason. And it's only, you know, later in life, I don't I don't know how or when that they presumably started, you know, spending more time outside, spending time with normal humans, being like, oh wow, no, that was very different from, you know, the way we think the world should work.
And nature, the nature versus nurture thing that you were saying, Joe, was yeah, that's a huge thing. Like that, you can. It would be very interesting to see what these characters would have been like being raised in a completely different situation, because there is a lot of their character flaws, and like obviously, you know, there's things about personality that are just inherent, but like a lot of the ways their personalities show themselves do stem, you can see how they stem from the way they were raised, and the way that like Diego and Luther have similar-ish coping mechanisms for being raised, being told they had one job and this is what they had to do. Klaus, you know, his coping mechanism is just to try to shut everything out. There's like Allison went to fame, and like Allison craved love so much that she like made people love her and became famous to like try to make up for never being loved as a child. Like there's all these really important things in how they express themselves now, and how they don't deal with the world very well, that definitely come explicitly straight from the way they were raised.
Yeah, the way the show is formatted, it reminds me of Arrow, because Arrow was a show that involved a great amount of flashbacks to a previous point in the main character's life. And those flashbacks always sort of informed what was happening in like the present day. And with the Umbrella Academy, you kind of got like 2 degrees of flashbacks or character backstories to go through. You got like the flashbacks when they were kids, and then also where they were between the time they left the Umbrella Academy and the start of the series. So you can't help but like every episode like get a little bit more information about each character and where they've been, and the audience being informed of like what their lives are like as kids, informing the story being told.
Just to touch on what Mjolnir said about Allison making everyone love her and pay attention to her, it's interesting to me that of the 2 sisters, their lives are so completely different. Vanya doesn't think she deserves anyone's attention or time or respect or love, and doesn't have a whole lot of it for herself. And so it's, it's the 2 sides of the same coin. Like, if, because there's the 7 siblings, but you end up with the 6 of them in the show. They're all kind of like foils for each other. Like, if you think of Luther and Five as a foil, and Diego and Klaus as a foil for each other, and Vanya and Allison, like, of the 2 females, like, one went out and became super famous, and the other one no one's ever even heard of, and her family doesn't even pay attention to her. So I think it's just interesting, like, those different dynamics that show up, like, with like how people react. It's almost like each sibling is like one type of reaction to an abusive upbringing, that like what you were saying about people not knowing, like, this is not how normal families function. The same is said for people who grow up in abusive households. Like, it's not just homeschooling, there's the other side of it. It's the abuse and neglect and coldness that they don't realize isn't normal until they are all adults and leave home.
I just want to say, like, well, when you're talking Joe, about the about the flashbacks from Arrow, and comparing that to some, and I think it's interesting. Like, I've seen about a season and a half of Arrow. My brother really liked it, so I was watching with him at one point, and I find the flashbacks were very formulaic, right? And you could, halfway through them, you could kind of see where they're going and stuff. Like, from what I saw of Arrow, like, it was good and stuff, but like there's a point where like you can see where this is going. I don't know. I think Umbrella Academy, like, the flashbacks are very important. To kind of give you, once again, kind of that grounding in their reality, because if you didn't have those flashbacks, it would be a lot harder to understand how these people act this way, and it makes them a lot more relatable, and you understand more when they do big things and mess things up and make decisions that don't seem to make sense. It really helps to have seen what their lives were like before. But like, I like that they use them sparingly, and they're sometimes you'll just suddenly get a flashback you weren't expecting or something, and they play around with them a lot more in the second season too, I believe, because there's more time travel stuff, so things jump around a bit more, and it's an interesting thing the show does. I like the way this show is structured, that a lot of the reveals are not really chronological, and they like to surprise you with it, and I think it works very well.
So for those of you who have read the comic, is this show a faithful adaptation? Because as we've gone along, we've seen more and more superhero movies and TV shows that sometimes are not very faithful to the source material, and it ends up actually being a better movie or TV show for it. But there also seems to be a strong narrative in the nerd culture community that oh, like if you're faithful to the source material, you're going to get a good result. So I guess in the case of Umbrella Academy, while it seems like a really great show, I got to ask, does the comic do it better? Is the show an improvement over the comic?
I mean, I've only read the first volume, but even there, it depends on what you mean by an adaptation. If you mean like a faithful representation of what the comic originally was, then no. But if you mean kind of the spirit of what the comic was, then I think yes, it is, because it does still have, it still encapsulates the weirdness of the comics, which I think is one of the reasons they did really well. The graphic novels or comics, can't remember which category officially it followed, but like there are certain elements that like it's like our reality, but it just a little bit off. And there's a lot of that in the show, especially uh, with the time traveling elements. That are a little bit ridiculous, but and I feel like, and also the comic does also kind of put a lot of emphasis on the relationship between the siblings, and that being kind of, the family dynamics or the weird dysfunction being important. So in that sense, I do think it's a good interpretation. In the same, I don't know if this is a good analogy because I don't know how many people have seen it, but like in the way that the Dirk Gently TV show, even though it has nothing to do with the original books, the spirit of Douglas Adams is still strong within the show. So I think in that sense, it's a good adaptation. But in the sense of like following the story or telling even the same story at all, not really that great of an adaptation, but I don't think it needs to be. And also, Mjolnir has something to add to that.
The graphic novel slaps you in the face with the weirdness right off the back. Like, just immediately, everything's weird. It's freaking insane. And, I mean, the show is insane. It is a lot more subtle with its weirdness, and it eases you in. It gives you little drops along the way, and even, like, some stuff gets weirder in the second season. They're like, all right, you were able to handle this weirdness, we're gonna ramp things up a bit. Like, and even there's certain reveals about certain characters that like are very matter of fact. They're very matter of fact, and like in the first couple pages in the comic that like you just get barely a glimpse of in the second season. And because the comics, like, it's no big deal, this is a weird comic book universe, it's fine, just take that. But like, a TV show, there is a certain level of realism that you need to like meet, and then you can ease people into it. And I think they do a very good job of, it would not be possible to adapt the way the comic is in a way that would work for TV, especially live action TV. Maybe like a cartoon, but the way it is, I think they did it the best way they could. I think it's really good. I like the show way more than the graphic novel from what I've read. I've only read the first volume, and I feel, when I had just seen one season of the show and read one volume of the books, I had more of a feel for the actual characters and the characterization from the show than the books. Like, maybe they delve into it more later on, but I felt like you got the overall sense of this dysfunctional family in the books, but I felt you didn't really get as much of a deep dive into each person's individual issues as much in reading the comics as you did in the show, because the comics, they just have a lot more going on in them. You don't have as much time to focus on individual people and their issues.
Yeah, like my experience with the graphic novel was that it went more superhero-y than the show does. Like the show just full on like deconstructs kind of everybody's like personal issues and stuff, which actually is more interesting to watch as opposed to like if they were to just translate the comic as is, because you've seen it time and time again. Like in my opinion, like it'll be like The Boys or whatever. I do like how, actually I don't know how I feel about it necessarily. Like in the comics, each of the children actually have like a superhero name, and they haven't really like outright gone and said those things, said those names on the show, as well as like a couple of like minor plot points that they didn't do in the show. Like just one thing, like they fought a living statue of Abraham Lincoln, and I think that was the second volume, and I thought that was hilarious, and I thought that could have fit in somewhere, but yeah, like in I do prefer I do hope that they like season 3 of the show seems like it's skipping over volume 3, like, and then going straight to volume 4, and I wonder, I'm excited to see like how they like move things forward. I wonder if they're gonna recall some things back, because there were a couple of things from these 2 seasons of Netflix that I thought could have used a couple more things from the source material. I guess they're trying to simplify it too as well, right? But yeah, like I highly recommend actually just picking up the first volume, because I think, yeah, it's actually one of the better reads from what I remember, just in the last little while.
My general opinion about adaptations is that what works really well on the page does not always necessarily translate well to the screen. Sometimes that means that, crazy stuff that happens in the pages won't happen on the screen, or, beloved characters get left aside, or, sometimes things just don't get included. And for some people, that might be the very thing that made them love the book, or the source material, and it's not in the adaptation, and therefore they hate it. And it's not necessarily because it's a bad adaptation, it's just because their favorite part isn't in it. I know with calling back to the last time I was here when we talked about Lord of the Rings, a lot of people were really upset that Tom Bombadil is not in the movies. He's one of the best characters in the book, but Peter Jackson and the other writers had to take a 1,000-page tome and narrow it down to something that they could follow and film and put together and make a cohesive movie out of. And so they basically decided to follow the story of Frodo taking the ring to Mordor, and that was it. Everything else is just kind of incidental, or everything else that wasn't even part of that, that's in the books that a lot of people love. A lot of the poetry, like there's a scene when Frodo is in Bree, basically telling an expanded version of the Cat and the Fiddle childhood rhyme, and he's on a table dancing, and that's how he ends up having the ring slip on his finger. But that's not in the movies because it's just a little too ridiculous for the feel that they're trying to do. And I think there's a lot of stuff like that that just will never make it onto the screen just because it doesn't work as well. There's a lot of stuff in the Game of Thrones books that, like in the Song of Ice and Fire series, that you just will never see on the screen, not just because the show is over and the last season completely ruined everything, but because it doesn't work. It doesn't work on the screen, and it's sad, but that's just a fact of doing adaptations.
See, I asked that question because I watched one YouTube video where the person, she was a fan of the comic and she felt that the TV show was a very poor adaptation of the comic. But she seemed torn on it, because even though she was so mad at things they left out, she also seemed to still enjoy the show. So I can understand some of the different things they couldn't put in there were probably budgetary. Like in the comic book, the Umbrella Academy makes their first appearance fighting a sentient version of the Eiffel Tower that has like a zombie inside it. Super crazy, wacky. That would be a lot of money to do with CGI, and they'd have to like try and film in France or somewhere close to France or something that looks like France. And in the comic or in the TV show, their first case is foiling a bank robbery, which is much more conventional, much lower budget. So I think I would almost say you would probably enjoy the show better if you have not read the comic. And as somebody who kind of fits into that mold of never read the comic, watch the show first, I was able to enjoy the show. But once I went back and saw the comics, I was like, man, I think I would have enjoyed the show better if it was more like the comic. And this episode is, I think we're actually going to split this up into 2 parts, beef pork ribs, because as I'm seeing, there's a lot of content here. So we're actually going to release the first half of this conversation this week, and then next week we're going to have the second half of the conversation go up.
If you want to reach the show, you can send us an email at
batjarpodcast@gmail.com.
or you can tweet us at
The Bat Cookie Jar.
You can find the Bat Jar Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, including YouTube, because we got a channel. Share our posts on Facebook, write reviews, give our shows a rating. This will help all people join us inside the Bat Jar, and we appreciate it dearly.
Until next week, when we hear the rest of the conversation about the Umbrella Academy, I'm Average Joe.
I'm Beef Pork Ribs.
I'm Mjolnir.
Libra the Book Lady.
El Pacifico.
Catch on the flip side.
Istanbul was Constantinople.
Doodles.
I'll see you between the shelves.
Just happy to be here.